Welcome to Tech Support, a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Tim Martin and Brian LeMaster.
Welcome back to another season. We're going to kick off the season with a 3-week series looking at the New Testament world. Today we're going to be looking at Judaism, and then the following two we're going to look at the culture and then the home. So I'm excited for this study. We got some good feedback from people that wanted to dive a little bit more into some of the backgrounds of the New Testament world. So we thought we would do a 3-week study on this. We're not going to cover the history that occurred between the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you're curious about that, go back to our last series, the one they call Christ, and look at episode 1, When Are We? We really focus on that part of it during that episode there. So today we want to look at more of what Judaism looked like. Tim, I know when we open up the Bible to the to the Old Testament, we have the law of Moses and we have some other things that kind of developed there in the Old Testament. But it seems like when we open up to the New Testament, we're living in a completely different religious atmosphere when it comes to the Jews and what some of that faith and practices looked like. You want to mention some of maybe those changes to kind of the institutions there as we kick off?
It certainly is a different world, and it's a world that myself and most everybody else refers to as Second Temple Judaism. Of course, that's beginning with the Second Temple that was rebuilt in the days that we see in Ezra and Nehemiah by Zerubbabel, because the first temple was destroyed by the Neo-Babylonians, and so the religion that we see in the New Testament period is a very developed form, I guess, of the Israelite religion, and has become very different, much as Christianity became very different as Christianity evolved and expanded and became sectarian, if you will, and divided up into Orthodox and Roman Catholic and Protestants and everything that's happened over the past 2,000 years. A lot of things happened with Judaism between the time of what we might say Ezra and Nehemiah and the time of Jesus. And we're going to talk about some of those things today, some institutions, some different Jewish sects that pop up, still all founded in what we call the Torah or the Law of Moses, the Pentateuch, whatever you want to call that. That is still the governing thing for everything that they believe in and what they would go to. The Pharisees have some differences there with some other oral tradition that they believe in as well. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I think it's very different. The basis is the same, but we can't read it the same as if they had the same practices as King David or King Solomon, or really to some extent Ezra and Nehemiah. And we see some very positive things that change. For example, they don't have a problem with idolatry anymore like they did during the kingdom period. And so I also realize they're in a very different historical situation, as you mentioned back in our previous episode. We talked about that. So yeah, it is very different, but we don't want to infer that, they started believing a different Bible or something like that.
Yeah.
Very different interpretation and implementation and some wide variety of beliefs that they would have. And those beliefs would vary geographically too. Palestinian Judaism versus what we call diaspora Judaism, the Judaism that's practiced.
You want to define those two?
Yeah, Palestinian, when I say Palestine often as meaning pretty much the area that Jesus lived and his disciples lived. I would say from Galilee all the way to, Jerusalem and maybe just south of that, as Palestinian Judaism, very centered on the temple. They're in their homeland. They're very upset about occupation by the Romans, versus diaspora, meaning the dispersion of Jews that Paul encountered in Galatia or in Thessaloniki or in Corinth or in, that he wrote to and eventually encountered in Rome, or Jews that were in Antioch or in Alexandria, Egypt, or wherever that may wind up being.
People see that term used in a couple of different writings at the opening of books as well, when he's writing to the scattered.
James,
there,
talking about to the dispersion, that Jews were dispersed all over the empire, and we don't know as much as we might think we want to know or do know or want to know about Judaism, but certainly are some differences in what people are expecting. We don't see Sadducees in Corinth, for example, because they're very centered around the temple. We don't see Samaritans in Rome. There's just some differences between that. And are they as worried about a Messiah as the ones who are in Palestine who want the Romans kicked out of their land? And so there's some differences in those things. And like I said, the religion has developed and evolved from what Moses and Joshua believed to the time. And those things changed, even from Solomon. He had a temple. They had a tabernacle. A lot of things have changed.
Which makes sense when you think of the temple being destroyed, how much that would change that setting. Like we see it again in AD 70, the next time it's destroyed.
Right.
What we see post that time looks much different than what we have occurring right now. Like
That's right. Some people make a mistake in interpreting the New Testament by using what I call, or what's generally called, rabbinic Judaism, meaning the Judaism that developed after the destruction of the temple and relies on like the Talmud, which was a set of Jewish writings codified about the year 200. That is you can't take what Judaism practices and believes today about certain things, or even what they believed in the year 200 or the year 100, and project it all the way back and say, okay, this is what they believed in Jesus' time. What's written in rabbinical Judaism may or may not exactly have been what they believed and practiced it in Jesus' day.
Yeah, so before we dive in, you just mentioned that. That's one of our sources there that gives some light to Judaism during this time period. The other one is the Bible, actually is a really good resource for the New Testament on Judaism. Doesn't mention everything, like the Pharisees and Sadducees are mentioned, but not every Jewish sect is mentioned. And then you also have an historian named Josephus, and that's really our three sources for understanding Judaism during this time period, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But some of those other sources do help us understand the Bible and what's being presented there and stuff. So,
yeah, I would also include the Dead Sea Scrolls in that. For a sect of Judaism that maybe we don't necessarily see in the New Testament.
Oh, yes.
Explicitly in the New Testament. I would say a lot of John the Baptizer's attitude towards the religious aristocracy in Jerusalem reflected very well the view of those same people by the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that does give us a little bit insight into expectations of a Messiah, et cetera.
All right, so let's jump into it. Tim, tell us about some of these institutions that we see pop up that may not be there in the Old Testament.
Yeah, we certainly don't have the idea of a synagogue in the New Testament, and that comes from the Greek word synagoge, that means just a gathering or an assembly, sort of like we might use the word ecclesia, like for a church. It's mostly translated in the New Testament. Doesn't exist in the Old Testament. We're not exactly sure of its origins. There's some different opinions on it. Some believe that there was a Jewish house of prayer, I think called a prosuke, that eventually developed into this synagogue. I think the earliest I could find that somebody said we see any reference to synagogues or sort of in the middle of the 3rd century, like around 240, 250 BCE in Egypt. And so we know a lot of Jews were in Egypt and around in Egypt. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew, has its origins in Egypt, at least legendarily it does. In that we don't really know, but we know it's a place that we see mentioned a lot in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and especially in the book of Acts. Every time Paul goes somewhere where there is a synagogue, that's the first place he goes because there's common ground there. They all believe in God, and they believe in the same scriptures, and they may be expecting a Messiah, and so he gets a friendly reception there.
When people see that word, should they kind of assume this is like a church, but for Jews, or does it also have a secular usage there as well?
Yeah, I think it would be a mistake to identify it as identical to what we would call a modern-day church. Most of our churches are designed for church operations, their worship or their Bible class. Different churches have things for the community and involved in those as well, but the synagogue, very multifunctional. It could be a place for a town meeting hall. It could be a place where like local decisions were made, if we want to say maybe even judicial decisions, or where maybe a council of the local elders may get together. It may have been used for educational purposes at times. May have been a place where people come together and debate religion, things about Judaism, but also a house of prayer. Obviously a place where the scriptures are read. Jesus reads Isaiah in a synagogue. And so there's obviously an organized get-together, I'd say. Worship is maybe the best way to define that, where liturgical readings like what Jesus did are present. I'm not sure about singing and along those lines. I don't really know what Jewish worship looked like in the 1st century. I'm sure there's those who do. I don't know necessarily what that means, but I would not say identify the synagogue as a direct parallel to a church, but for the aspect of education, honoring God, praising God, reading scripture, yeah, those things. But we typically don't have other types of just what you might say, you said it well, a secular meeting, because you think about it, they don't have buildings like we have all the time to go to, especially in smaller communities. Even the church worshiped in houses. They didn't own buildings, it seems, for a couple of centuries at least. Where are you going to go? Well, we'll go to the synagogue. We see the centurion that Jesus encountered, that we see in the scriptures that's a friend of the Jews where Jesus went to him. He built a synagogue. So he was a great patron of that community and wanted to do something nice for the Jews, so he builds a synagogue. And so you give them some place to go and meet. Otherwise, where are they going to go? They can't go to a Roman government building and do it. And so it served a lot of purposes.
And at first, years ago, I almost viewed them as like mini temples. Like it's like, because you can't go to the temple, we're going to have these like secondary places where you can come and gather. But we don't see any evidence of sacrifices being made, the typical things that you would see with the priesthood. It seems to be a place of prayer and scripture reading. And I think it's interesting because when you think about the shift from what we would think the temple with sacrifices to the worship we see in the New Testament, the synagogue seems to be a bridge between those two worlds.
That's
to some
a good way
degree.
of pointing. Yeah, I don't know of any. I'm not saying there wasn't any sacrifices or things like that, but that seems definitely to be focused on the temple in Jerusalem. And I don't think these things were ever meant to be that way.
Yeah,
I think they were just a place for the Jews to meet together and conduct themselves and conduct their business and conduct their honoring of God and the reading of their scripture. But yeah, a bridge may be a good way of thinking about what modern day churches have become. And to say there are many modern day churches who do allow people to use their building for other purposes, but not a particular ethnic sect.
But for some of the Jews that went to the synagogue here, like that gathering for a time of instruction, for a time of prayer, would have already been built into kind of their understanding of faith.
Paul
not
goes
just
multiple Sabbaths.
Just, the only religious thing we do is go and make sacrifices at the temple. Like that's not.
Yeah, I think it's really a beautiful thing in some ways. I mean, we know they met at the Sabbath on the Sabbath in the synagogue. I mean, Paul continually goes. Every time he's at a place, he goes to the synagogue sometimes for several weeks in a row. That's where they gather to meet. And it's a beautiful thing that the Jews wanted to get together even when they weren't in Palestine and listen to God's word being read and to talk about things and pray. And I think it's a wonderful thing.
All right, so what about this Sanhedrin? We see this pop up in the Gospels. We'll see it being referenced early on in Paul's life. What do we know about the Sanhedrin?
Okay, I think we do know a little bit more about that. I was kind of just going through my notes. It was essentially a Jewish council. Our understanding is it was generally about 70 to 71 members. I think that's based on like the 70 elder council in Numbers 11 and Exodus 24 or something similar to that. My understanding is it does have its origins in the Hasmonean period. That's the time period where the Jews freed themselves from Greek rule and kind of ruled themselves from about 167 BCE to about the year 63 when Pompey took over there. And so I think that's where we think its origins are. The name really literally means seated together, I think, in Hebrew. So a group coming together. Now, I cannot imagine a council of 70 people being able to come to any sort of agreement on anything. And we have enough difficulty with 10 or 12 people trying to come to that. But I wrote down some of the things that they may have affected, and we see this in the New Testament. Judicial or civil affairs amongst the Jews, kind of like, Pilate's almost like, this is your problem. You deal with this guy type thing. The administration of the temple, maybe even having a little bit of a police force, like whoever they sent to arrest Jesus, a little bit of like some kind of police squad in that area. And so it just seems like they are a unit of Jews that are there to take care of Jewish business that doesn't affect Rome or have any fall under necessarily Rome's concern or purview. Maybe they decided some religious things, but they do seem to be only in Jerusalem, that there's not a Sanhedrin everywhere that you go around to. And so that's what little bit I know about them, but just kind of a ruling council.
Did you find anything on like how somebody enters into that council?
Seemed like I have read something about that in time. I'm going to say it was probably one of those, privileged positions, who you were an honorable Jew, maybe a knowledgeable Jew. I think of who Gamaliel is speaking to in Acts when he says, hey, we ought to leave these guys alone if this is something from God. I think sometimes they get painted in a picture because of their animosity towards Christ, and perhaps even some group of or portion of them affecting his trial, that they were all just these evil people. I don't think so. I think Gamaliel wasn't that way. And I don't know. I think, is Joseph of Arimathea described as a prominent member of the council?
I think so.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd have to go double check that. And then like Nicodemus, I think maybe he's a member of the Sanhedrin. I'm not sure about that, but I think Joseph of Arimathea is described in that way. But he's not a bad guy. I mean, he's the one who goes to bury Jesus somewhere. And so I don't think we need to always.
He was careful.
That's right. He was careful. I mean, he's a politician. And so I think we want to be careful in painting them as like this group of devilish figures. They were just the Jewish council, and probably had been around for a long time, and taking care of some things, especially religious things that were of no concern to the Roman government.
All right. Anything else before we keep going on the institutions there?
No, and obviously we're, like you said, we've got limited. The New Testament is a pretty big source for many of these things.
One thing I saw,
there's more that could be said here, but we could spend a whole episode talking about just these two institutions, I think, but we do have limited information on them.
Yeah, I didn't go and like do the count of all these, but one thing I was reading said that Josephus only references like the Pharisees, I think 20 times in his writings, like, which is not a lot because he identifies as a Pharisee in the ones he talks about the most. But
his
when you think about his writings, only 20 references. I mean, that's not.
Yeah, that's not much. And so the New Testament is probably our primary source for some of these things. And then the Sadducees, definitely in the New Testament. And I think whatever Josephus has to say about Sadducees is somewhat suspect since he's a Pharisee. He may not be necessarily looking at them in a good light.
All right. So what do we know about these different groups that get developed once we enter into the New Testament that's not there in the Old Testament?
Yeah, we don't see Pharisees, at least by that name, in the Old Testament, nor do we see these Sadducees. Now, I would say that they developed from things in there. Certainly the Sadducees, we're not real sure. Like, let's talk about them first, for example. Sadducees, some people think that the etymology of their name came from Zadok, the Zadokite priesthood that we see in the Old Testament. We're not real sure where that name Sadducees came from. I know we have the kids' name. It's the kids' song that say they're Sadducees because they don't believe in resurrection. So they're sad, you see. That is not the origin. That is not the etymology of the name. They are strongly associated with the priesthood, a very aristocratic group of people, probably smaller than the Pharisees is my understanding. Where the Pharisees are more a party of the people, I think these are probably more like your religious elite. You're probably kind of born into being a Sadducee in a way. Some of the big things, I know the number one thing people point out in the New Testament, and it's pointed out in the New Testament, that the Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection. And that is correct. Not only did they not believe in a resurrection, they didn't believe in life after the dead at all, life after death at all. And so in some ways, I've often told classes that I'm somewhat respectful of that belief. Into the fact is they still wanted to obey God with no promise of an afterlife, of a reward in the afterlife. Now, I want you to tell me how many Christians would be faithful to their church and their attendance and their good works if there was no promise of heaven, if you just knew you were going to die. And so they do, I think, believe that God would restore their land. I know they rejected fate or that everything was already predetermined or predeterminism. I think they believed in free will, but they definitely didn't believe in a resurrection or an afterlife. I don't think they believed in angels, but probably the biggest thing I would say about them from a religious belief is they were what I call Torah-only believers. Only the law of Moses, as you said earlier. I'm not sure their view on the authority and use of the writings and the prophets, but they were Torah only. They would be very similar to what I would call restorationists and probably reformists of the 16th century, that it's sola scriptura. They only believe in that, whereas we'll explain in a minute, the Pharisees had additional things that they believed other than just the written Torah.
Yeah, and what's interesting when you think about how the New Testament kind of represents them, a lot of times they're just thrown in with the Pharisees.
Yeah, they don't have as many encounters with Jesus. Now, they do have some where they're kind of directly, I think they're the ones who confront him with the, hey, so-and-so's married to so-and-so.
The resurrection
how many,
question.
is he going to have 7 wives or whatever in the resurrection?
But from my memory, that's the only time that you really see them being isolated for a different belief. A lot of times it's just the Pharisees and the Sadducees did this or questioned that, so I think we highlight some of the distinctiveness, but I wonder how distinct they were in every, like, did they agree on 90% of things?
Yeah, and I think you're probably correct. I don't know if 90% is
that may be too high, but yeah.
But I think we shouldn't say that they were diametrically opposed on every point. And what did also Paul, I can't remember when in Acts, remember he sets them against each other on resurrection too. Mm-hmm. They're all worried about him, and then he gets them arguing amongst themselves, and he's able to just slip off, while they're arguing amongst themselves and no longer care about him.
One thing that my understanding of these groups, that has changed over the years is, at first I viewed these two groups, like the Pharisees and Sadducees at first were the only two that I heard about, almost like our political parties today, that the vast majority of the country is in one of those two parties.
Oh, yeah.
And that, like, they're pinned against one another and they're just battling one another. But, like, the more I've studied this, like, there's a percentage of the Jews that are a part of these groups, but it's not that 75% of Jews are in one of these groups. So that changes my perspective a little bit of how I originally saw these two groups there.
Majority of Jews didn't have time to worry about it. I think I've heard the numbers like 6,000 or 7,000 Pharisees and
that's the number
a
I've
much
seen,
lesser number of Sadducees. So let's just say less than 10,000 people were affiliated with this. Now, we know it may stretch out a little ways. Paul says his family were Pharisees. Now, I don't know if that means while they were in Cilicia or maybe while they were in Jerusalem, he was being educated by Gamaliel. It's like you said, we do expect every Jew in existence was either a Pharisee or a Sadducee. Really, the vast majority probably couldn't care less. They were too busy working and taking care of business and taking care of their families to worry about, Jewish sectarianism.
Josephus and Antiquities, he highlights that you had referenced this earlier, but they seem to be a smaller group because they're higher end in society. They're more of the elite people.
The
Sadducees here. Yeah. That they're the higher end people. They control like the temple tax of like trading things out. That's kind of where they got their money, but that they're not the group among the people. Like they didn't hold that popular, I can rally the crowd like the Pharisees did, is the way that he presents them, which, is biased, but that's kind of how he presents them there.
I would definitely say too, that they were probably a group of, both of them, probably a group of people of a better education.
Yep.
I often tell people, if you look how Jesus talks to them, he would say, have you not read in the law of Moses, where when he speaks to the average people, he says, have you not heard? Well, that's because most of the average people couldn't read. But it does seem that there's a higher level of education amongst the Pharisees and Sadducees and the scribes. We definitely would say that we also need to talk about.
Yeah. You want to mention the scribes before we jump to the
Pharisees?
Yeah,
the scribes is not something that sometimes that term is translated like lawyers. I think that's I wouldn't say a bad translation, but it's a misleading translation because we don't think about a lawyer as being they are an expert in the law, but not for religious purposes or for teaching purposes. It's more for dealing with parties and criminals and contracts and real estate and things along those lines. Whereas the scribes are experts and interpreters of Torah. They would be the modern day scholars, the modern day academics that are researching, trying to interpret things, trying to understand stuff, dig in. What does this mean for us today? They would be equivalent to modern day academics who dig into those things.
One other thing before we jump to the Pharisees about the Sadducees is we talked about our resources that we had earlier about this time frame. We have nothing from a Sadducee's point of view.
No, I don't
There's
think so.
no that I know of. There's no direct this person says they're a Sadducee and this is what
here's the diary of a Sadducee. We don't have that yet.
That vantage point or anything like that. And with the temple being destroyed in AD 70 there, that's why they disappear because their power was all wrapped up in the temple. So when that got destroyed, the group that kind of rose out of that was the Pharisees. So everything after that is through their vantage.
I think that's what most people would say is that what rabbinic Judaism came from Pharisaic beliefs and Pharisaic beliefs.
All right. So Tim, what do we know about these Pharisees?
Maybe a little bit more, but not a ton more. I know that their name supposedly comes from a Hebrew word meaning to distinguish. They did believe in angels. They believed in a resurrection. They believed in an afterlife. They certainly believed in the written Torah, what you referred to as the law of Moses or the Pentateuch. The big difference between them and the Sadducees is they also believed in what is commonly referred to as the oral Torah, which is, my understanding, a set of teachings that were given to Moses that he didn't write down, but that he had and committed to the elders and talked to the elders of the Israelites, and they handed that oral Torah down generation to generation. Now, it's hard to believe nobody ever wrote that down, but eventually that does get codified in the Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud, the rabbinic, the core of rabbinic Judaism. They have a Mishnah and a Gemara. I don't know if it's pronounced Gemara or Gemara, which is a commentary on the oral Torah. But a lot of the things that we see referred to as traditions amongst the the Pharisees probably come from this oral Torah. Now, the Sadducees would not have believed in that. And so today we might call that similar to like maybe a catechism or a set of writings that a particular Christian tradition may have that they practice in addition to the New Testament and the Bible. And so they did believe in free will and fate. They did believe in fate, maybe predeterminism. But there's obviously, and we see Jesus kind of chastising them, a focus on external things, their piety being my behavior so people can see it. And they see that I am Torah observant, and they see that I don't work on the Sabbath, or they see that I observe dietary laws. And I think that makes sense based on what Jesus tends to rebuke them for, is they're doing things just for show. What do you have there in your research?
Yeah, well, building off of that, I really feel like the differences between Christianity and the Pharisees came down to what is pure and what's righteous. And they had built up this idea that, because I'm a descendant of Abraham, because I do all these outward things, I'm so much more superior, and we should push out those that are unclean or those that are like look down on society because that's not pure, and that's not righteous. Where Jesus comes in and he says, no, like, we're going to love the sinner. We're going to care for the sick, to where they only saw them as unclean and don't have anything to do with that. Where that seems to be, to me, where a lot of the tension is between Jesus and them is, no, righteousness doesn't look that way. Like righteousness is to love and to care for. And that's not how you define being clean and unclean anymore.
Jesus' parable about the tax collector and the Pharisee, which is one of my favorite teachings of Jesus that I can compare to a lot of people in our religious world today, is he says the Pharisee goes before God and essentially is, look at me, at least I'm not like this filthy tax collector over here. And the tax collector takes a position of beating his chest and confessing, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus says that guy was more justified, the tax collector, than the Pharisee, which would have been a real slap in the face to his audience, who probably felt like the Pharisees probably felt like, I could stand before God any day I wanted to, as being blameless. And I would say that many of them were very law-abiding. Paul says he was blameless according to the law, and if he was affiliated with the Pharisees.
And you see Jesus plant those seeds in every teaching pretty much. Like, we're not to the Samaritans yet, but he'll use Samaritans in stories. He'll use anytime he can build up someone to shock them of like, the person that did the right thing or the good thing wasn't what you thought. Yeah. Like, it was a lowly person or a sinful person or a Samaritan. And that's where I see a lot of the tension point.
I could see people looking up to these folks. Like a lot of times today, some people would venerate elders or deacons or other church leadership as being like immune to sin and a little bit higher level of righteousness than just the average parishioner, which shouldn't be their view at all. Look at that. But I would see that these people were probably thought to be more pious, more educated in scriptures, a little bit higher level than the average farmer and metal worker or woodworker. I could see where they would maybe, and get that can go to their head a little bit if they get venerated a little bit too much as the religious leadership. They didn't serve as servants like they should have. Yeah. They weren't the shepherds that they should have been.
A similar thing happens to Christians. Like, we see that throughout history. We probably see it in every city. This idea of things going to their head because I've done X, Y, and Z. I'm a better person.
That's right.
One thing that I think is interesting when we think about the Pharisees as a group is they seem to have a lot of like political interest. Some of the quotations that I saw, like going through like Josephus's work, it seems to be like when there's different powers or a change of power, like they're trying to gain some type of like power control through the Romans or this other leader, to where it's not like they have true power, but it's like they're trying to gain almost like a political interest group with those that are actually in charge. It's not just a religious thing. Like there's also
they're trying to acquire honor.
Yeah, a control of the people, and just the way the Jews worked, while being under like Roman rule and things. Tim, you got anything else on the Pharisees?
Not on the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I guess. I'm just thinking about the Zealots are mentioned. We'll talk about the Samaritans.
All right, yeah. What do you want to say about the Samaritans?
I want to say a lot about the Samaritans. There's a lot of things I hear about Samaritans, and so we need to go through that a little bit. I had a challenging question one time from one of my professors who said, were Samaritans Jews? And I had to think about my answer to that question, and I really don't know if I ever answered it correctly or if there is a correct answer to that. Some of it depends if you're talking about an ethnic Jew or you're talking about a religious Jew. In some ways, I would say that they definitely are related to ethnic Jews, and religiously, they're very much related to Jews. And so the origins of Samaritans are debated. Many people, they obviously are unliked by a lot of the people we just talked about in Jerusalem and around those areas. They were not welcome, but they're talked about a lot in the New Testament. And so we need to kind of understand where they come from. Some believe their origins are in way back all the way to 722 BCE, when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, or its capital, Samaria, and they deported a lot of Jews, and then they imported some of their own people to intermarry and to continue to work the land and provide revenue. It wasn't as if you invade a land and leave it abandoned. You put people back in there. So there was a lot of intermarriage with what we might call people who non-Jews, foreigners, Gentiles, whatever you want to call them. And some think the descendants of those people became what are referred to as Samaritans. So they were looked at as kind of semi-Jews, but not really purebred Jews, and maybe they can't trace their lineage. I don't think most Jews could probably trace their lineage all that well either. That we can't say, well, I didn't have a single Gentile in the woodpile here. I mean, I think that's ridiculous to think that was the case. Or that they all stayed married within just one tribe, that they would say. And so now we do see some genealogies like Jesus that tend to follow a line, but that's what. Now I'm a little bit hesitant, and scholars are hesitant to just say that's absolutely the case, because that is, nearly 800 years removed from the time of Jesus to say, okay, that's all these people were. I think they were a religious group that was not just comprised of people of a certain ethnicity or not full of Jews. They had women. Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well is an excellent example.
I was hoping you were going to go there.
Yeah, in John chapter 4, it's my favorite encounter with Jesus.
We're just covering all your favorites.
Well, that's
today.
right. Well, because it's the one. Every time Jesus talks to men, they cower down. This woman just keeps firing back at him. When he talks to women, they seem to be able to hold their own with Jesus rather than cowering down. But this woman is surprised that a Jewish man is talking to her, because Jews don't have relations with Samaritans. Luke explains that. John explains that, which tells me that John's audience was not Palestinian, or they wouldn't need that explanation. And they worship on Mount Gerizim. You Jews think you're supposed to worship down in Jerusalem. So we start seeing some clues about the differences in their belief. And primarily it was that they worshiped on Mount Gerizim, which is one of the two mountains where the Israelites walked in between going in the Promised Land. And at one time there was a temple there. I think we found the ruins of that temple, but it had been destroyed before the time of Jesus. But they still worshipped on Mount Gerizim. They also had a different Torah. It's referred to today called the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's an excellent source for Hebrew Bible textual criticism. They had a Torah that was slightly different in many ways than what we would call the Masoretic text of Torah, or even the Septuagint text. Sometimes they agree, but there are things that are different about where to worship. And so I think their origins are a little bit unclear, but they do appear to be people who believed in Yahweh, and they believed in the law of Moses, even though they may have a little bit different version of it. They don't seem to be a violent people. They don't seem to be. Some people accuse them of taking sides against the Jews with some of the Jews' enemies or the Israelites' enemies. I saw one person, it seems like I even said that maybe they were the group that opposed the rebuilding of the temple. In the time that we see accounted for in the beginning of the book of Ezra. I don't think that's clear, at least from biblical resources. So some I think I was trying to, villainize the Samaritans, but I really think they got a really bad rap, and they're painted in a pretty good picture. The only leper out of the 10 that came back
Yep.
to thank Jesus for healing him was a Samaritan. Jesus tells the most famous parable to everybody on the planet, the Good Samaritan, paints in a good picture why it was an indictment against the Levites and the priesthood. But now at times Jesus says we're not going to go into Samaria either, or we're going to go around Samaria. But then in Acts we see Philip, his main mission point is into Samaria, and so it's important. And there's a lot more than what we've mentioned today, but it is good that we.
So briefly, what kind of happens to the Samaritans?
That's a good thought.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off there. Because
if they eventually just get swallowed up, I don't know. But I'll say this: I know that there are still practicing Samaritans today in Palestine, or what we might call Israel. So they don't get eradicated. I'm going to guess maybe some of them folded into Rabbinic Judaism, but I think they continue to maintain their own religious belief. That's what I understand. I haven't met a Samaritan from Israel to be able to say that with absolute certainty, but I'm not so sure it would be correct to say that they're extinct. I'm not so sure that they aren't still Samaritans today, obviously 2,000 years removed from that follow the Samaritan Pentateuch. I know the Samaritan Pentateuch has been well preserved because it is, like I said, a big resource for the study of the Hebrew Bible and textual criticism. So nothing happened to them. They're flourishing.
All right, our final group, what about the Zealots?
We don't see as much of them mentioned, but in short, as one might think, they have zeal for Israel. They are those who want the Romans kicked out, maybe a militant group of people who would like, they're the rebels of Star Wars. I mean, they want the empire, my Roman Empire kicked out of here. We want to restore this to that. I think that's the group of people that they tried to get Jesus to offend when they said, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And he responded by whose images and inscription is on there. I think they were trying to get Jesus to do one of two things: commit sedition against the Roman Empire by saying, don't pay the tax, or make the Zealots very angry by saying, oh yeah, I know you hate the guy's image on there and you hate the fact that he claims himself to be the high priest and the august son of God, and you hate paying the Romans any tax because you don't think that would be. I think they were trying to put Jesus between a rock and a hard place, and he wiggled right out of it like he typically does.
All right, because of time, let's keep moving along. I know we could keep talking about these groups because they're very interesting.
Its own episode, yeah.
For this next part, Tim, let's talk about kind of what's distinctive about Judaism, or what makes it unique when we think about that religion.
Yeah, there's a few simple things. Obviously, being monotheistic, meaning a belief in only one God and worshiping only one God. Now, certainly Israel was not that way throughout its history that we see, especially in the kingdom period or even before that. But in a world where everybody believed in a pantheon of Greek and Roman gods and household gods and, their ancestors and lots of different cults like an Isis cult, the Jews were unusual in the fact that, and it was believed in only one God. And so that I think most of our listeners understand, but I think we want to appreciate how unique they were and how that could be viewed as very strange. Also, we think about their observance of the Sabbath. They're the only ones that observed the Sabbath, obviously, because they're the only one that had the reason to, meaning God created the earth and ceased from his work on the seventh day, and also that he brought them up out of the land of Egypt. That's the two reasons in Exodus and in Deuteronomy they're told to observe the Sabbath. I know a lot of people, I don't know this from primary writings, that maybe the Jews were viewed as a little bit lazy and not working on it, because this is a 7-day-a-week work week. There's no such thing as a weekend in a society where if you didn't work that day, you didn't eat that day. So they were viewed, that was very strange that they observed this day from not working. If I was going to attack a group of Jews, I'd attack them on the Sabbath. And so that's one. The other thing that's particular that we don't have to expand on a lot is the anticipation of a Messiah. They called Caesar by the same Greek words that we translate Lord and Savior, and we use about Jesus. And I think they're used about Jesus in many ways because they were used about Caesar. Caesar was the one that brought grain when you were hungry and put on the games and took care of people. But the Jews were unique, and they were expecting a Messiah to do blank. Throw off the Roman yoke and bring about some utopia, whatever the belief was, depending on where you were. Obviously, the Greeks and the Romans had no need for a Messiah. They did not need that in that expectation. But the two things I think we should spend a little bit of time on is circumcision. That obviously becomes a very, very touchy point, especially in the early days of Christianity, with the Jews wanting them to do that, and also the dietary laws. and including under that table fellowship. And so I know you're an expert on circumcision, so I'm going to let you go first on circumcision. What would you like to say about circumcision? I don't know if you're an expert or not.
All I can think about is this comedian's joke where he's reenacting Abraham's conversation when he goes home about what he's got to do.
That's right. Abraham was a man of real faith to do that as an adult. And poor Timothy had to go through that as an adult.
Yeah, I think one thing that I want you to highlight here, hopefully our audience is familiar with it when it comes to the textual standpoint, Old Testament and New Testament as well. Mm-hmm. But explain to us some of why it was so meaningful to the Jews. Like, why was it such a big deal when we see them talk about this in the New Testament? Like, what's some of the history behind some of that?
I think it's important. Here's what we can deduce, at least. Obviously, it goes all the way back to Abraham. And it was the sign and seal of the covenant God made with Abraham to multiply his people and give him this land. That's even pre-Moses. You know, we would put it within the boundaries of what we call the law of Moses, but it was probably some 500 years before Moses ever walked this earth that this covenant is made, and it's told in the law of Moses, you're going to circumcise your children on the 8th day. So as old as being a people of Abraham is this covenant of circumcision, what a promise. And how important that promise is, because it involved the land while you're in the land, but the land is not yours. The Romans have come in and taken it from you. You've lived under the Greeks. In more recent history for the Jews, circumcision had been outlawed by some Greek rulers. Antiochus Epiphanes IV is a big one. We probably talked about that in that other episode. Outlawed circumcisions. Mothers' children were killed if they circumcised them. So a very sensitive issue. And now, the Jews were not the only people in the ancient world who circumcised, but they certainly were, I think, probably the only ones where everybody was circumcised. Some people like the Egyptians, I understand, the priests might have been circumcised. But everybody was circumcised. And in a world where you exercised in the nude and you went to the bath in the nude, it wasn't, in our society, it's something you can kind of hide. I don't want to know, but I'm not real sure.
Kind of hide. I don't know what kind of.
Yeah, I mean, we hide that
gyms
from people.
You go to. But
well, the gyms I go to are a little more progressive than maybe the one.
It's definitely hidden today.
Yeah, that's right. It's definitely something that we just wouldn't know. I don't know walking around church on Sunday morning who's circumcised, who's not circumcised. But it would probably be a little bit more known and viewed as a mutilation. I don't know if a source of ridicule or whatnot. We could look at Roman writings on that perhaps. But that was something, and it obviously becomes a real sticking point in early Christians when Gentiles begin to convert to Christianity. And there's a lot of debate. We see it primarily in Romans and Galatians. We see it as the first issue that's hauled before the council in Jerusalem from Antioch when Paul and Barnabas go back and say, hey, these Gentiles that are converting to Judaism, do they have to obey the law of Moses? Should they be circumcised? The answer from the council is no, but obviously that problem persists in Galatia, in Rome, where we're still trying to keep the works of the law, whether it's dietary law, circumcision, whatever. And Paul says it's no good anymore. It's not necessary. We're talking about them throwing off what may have been close to 2,000 years of Jewish strong belief in that covenant with Abraham. That's why it was sensitive. Yeah. And I think that's why it was
permanent.
Important. Yeah, that's
identifying,
right. No, it could be reversed. There were procedures, and some Jews. The other thing is, it's good to say that. I say that joking around a little bit, but I can't remember what the procedure is called. But it has a name where they can get that skin replaced, and some Jews did that to better fit in with their Roman and Greek counterparts, and that would have been viewed as disgusting by the Jews. So that is, I can't remember what the name of the procedure is, but that is something that also would be like, hey, you people are conforming to this world by doing away with your circumcision that your poor mom and dad did to you. Very sensitive issue.
Yeah. This would be something that's a little bit different, I think, for us today. What's up with the table fellowship, these dietary laws? Like,
yeah, I know everybody says, well, Jews can't eat pork. Well, there's a lot of things Jews can't eat. They can't eat buzzards either. And they can't eat catfish. There's a lot of things. We see that primarily in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Our listeners are welcome to go look those things up. Contrary to what people say, we don't know why God established these dietary laws. It has nothing to do with preparing food properly and cooking at the right temperature. I can't eat raw beef either.
You just made somebody mad.
Yeah, I probably just made somebody mad. But ultimately, I'll tell you what the Jews say. We don't know why God did these, but we're going to do it because God says so.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish Christians would take more of that attitude towards the Bible. We do not know why they couldn't eat certain things on looking and thinking about these two things. And maybe one day God's going to say, no, Tim, I did it because pigs water in their own filth. I'm like, okay, well, there's other animals that do that too. And so we don't know why. But it was something that was very different about Jews, maybe even a point of ridicule, but very important to our New Testament, our understanding, because we see, for example, Peter's vision in the book of Acts before he goes to Cornelius' house. Even as a Christian, he says, oh, no, I have never eaten anything unclean. So for people who think that the apostles stopped practicing Judaism the minute they became Christians, they haven't read their Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so
there's that period of time is very interesting as they transition from one to the other. Like,
that's right. Even Paul made Timothy get circumcised so it doesn't cause any trouble. But Timothy could have been like, wait a minute, I thought you just wrote a letter. It said that's supposed to be circumcised. These dietary laws were very separated them. And obviously it's very important to Peter, for example, not to violate them. Peter's another example of table fellowship. And so one of the things that gets put in this umbrella of dietary laws is, for example, how do I go into a Gentile's house and eat? And I don't know if he's mixed dairy and meat together in the same utensils or dishes or cooked them together. How do I know this meat wasn't sacrificed to an idol?
Where the meat came from.
How do I know this meat doesn't come from the thigh of a cow? Because we don't eat that either because Jacob wrestled with God and, somehow paralyzed his thigh. That's one story I look forward to getting more information on one day. So as the text tells us in Genesis, Jews don't eat the back half of a cow or the thigh meat of an animal. So how do I know if that food's been contaminated? Like I said, been sacrificed to idols, how it's been prepared. And also in table fellowship, if I go eat at your house, I am in a way endorsing you as somebody who agrees with me that I keep company with. Jesus was killed for who he ate with. He ate with tax collectors and sinners. That's the accusation against him. I know ultimately he was killed because he eventually confessed to being the Son of God.
But that's where that tension is between the Jews and him.
That's right. Just like you said, these aristocratic people who don't associate with those kind of people, Jesus said, hey, the well don't need a doctor, the sick need a doctor, and that's who I'm going to. And so this is very important. We see this in the book of Galatians where Paul explains about, well, Peter came out, he hung out with all the Gentile people at the table until his buddies from Jerusalem showed up. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing. And then all of a sudden he withdrew fellowship from them, not eat at the same table. Yeah. How much imagery does Jesus give us about table fellowship? Messianic banquet. Mm-hmm. Don't sit at the head of the table lest the guy come and say, oops, somebody more honorable than you has shown up and to put you at the end of the table. Table seating was very important. I think when he went to Simon's house and ate, the fact that he was sitting next to Simon having a conversation about the woman washing Jesus' feet, I think Jesus was reclining at a position of honor right next to the owner of the house at that dinner because he seems to want to honor Jesus, and Jesus says, you didn't honor me like you should have in the fact that you didn't offer me water for my feet and oil to anoint my head. But I don't think he's yelling across the room. And so where you even sat at a table was very important. But keeping table fellowship and going into a Gentile's house, we see this in the Cornelius story. Even Cornelius says, I don't think you coming into my house? And I think of the Roman centurion with Jesus. He says that definitely to Jesus. I know you're not going to come under, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. Maybe he knew that Jesus as a Jew didn't need to go into a Gentile's house, but you just don't know look at all the debate we see about food sacrificed to idols later on in the New Testament writings. And so I think it's pretty well known that table fellowship was one of those things where it really was like, okay, I'm endorsing, I agree with this person, I'm associating with them, going to Zacchaeus' house, for example, and eating. And so that was been very, very frowned upon.
Do you think they cared about it more from a being clean and unclean? Is it more from, not to skip ahead to like next week, but is it more of an honor shame? Like why to the Jews is that so important to not
defile yourself?
Yeah, not have that table fellowship with somebody that could be frowned upon by other people.
Yeah, I mean, like the Jerusalem council gets pretty angry with Peter for going into Cornelius' house. Like, what are you doing going into a Gentile's house? And of course, he explained to him what happened, and they were like, okay. I don't know. I'm trying to think of it within an honor-shame context. That's a really broad context to think about. I think the clean, unclean is the way to describe it.
Yep.
Is I think there's a pretty firm belief that you could become ritually unclean by going into a Gentile's house because who knows what you've been exposed to. and you have endorsed them. And so I think there was a religious aspect to it, or supernatural aspect to it. You know what I mean? Something
That's where
other
my
than
mind goes.
something other than just what you put in your mouth, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't like to write the word. Almost just philosophically unclean because you have gone into the house of a Gentile, because we are keeping ourselves separate from the Gentiles. And think about the sensitivity of that. What happened in Israel's history when we intermingled with the Gentiles? Well, we intermarried with them. When Solomon got off the rails, we went into idolatry. I don't know this enough. My guess would be that just somewhere someone has said that one of these reasons for this is to keep absolute separation between ourselves and Gentiles, so we do not go back to making the mistakes of our forefathers. I may be alone on an island saying that, but
that's where I go as well. I think it's about not being unclean, but then also that separation, being pure from people that you look down upon. That
I think that's in addition to dietary laws. Dietary laws, in their basic thing, is I'm not going to eat the things that God says I'm not supposed to eat. And that's if somebody has some insomnia, sometime they can read through those things. But
they were definitely unique.
They were unique. The table fellowship is a very, very key thing to understand in understanding the Gospels and Acts, and perhaps even Paul's writings, and the meat sacrifice to idols type thing.
As we wrap up, you got a final thought?
No, I think hopefully this has been a lot shortly, and we're going to go over some cultural things next week. But one of the big things, and I'm telling this to a class I'm teaching this topic on right now, is we need to understand these things so we do not go back and misinterpret the Bible because we view it with a 21st century lens. We need to understand their world. And next week's going to be a lot of that, because family life in general, the culture was absolutely nothing like the Western world. And so we need to, other than the fact that they've committed sexual immorality, that's about it. It is very different. And so the perspectives and worldview, religiously, scientifically, politically, everything was so different that I hear people all the time today, Bible class teachers, everybody, interpreting as if these people thought like we do, and they don't, or they didn't.
Yeah. And don't be discouraged that all of our questions cannot be answered, because there's several things we would like to know more about, but we know enough that it can shape a more healthy interpretation of the text, where we're not taking, like Tim said,
next
that
week,
stuff
remind me next week, I'd like to offer a couple of books that our audience could maybe read, that I would endorse as ones that I use, that are single volumes that contain information that would be good. If you just want to buy one or two books about the topic, there's some out there that would really help you in your Bible study to have on your shelf. Remind me to mention that.
Will do. If you got any questions or suggestions for future topics, let us know by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for tech support. We hope you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.